Okay, that's lovely. I've actually been teaching this lesson for 45 minutes with my microphone muted. That's really cool. Well, I'm glad somebody tuned in to give me a heads up on that. So let's restart the whole thing here. Hi, my name's Wall. Welcome to Wallcraft. I just recently migrated everything over to hardware, so apologies for the frustration and delay in the sound here. I'm gonna go back through the last 45 minutes, I guess, and just redo it. Uh, Unfortunately, the microphone was muted, so we didn't cap anything that we had gotten here. That's fine, though, because I got nothing else we were looking forward to right now, besides discussing this. Excellent. Thank you for letting me know, Everlook Jr. We're going to take a 5-minute break while I smoke a cigarette, just make sure everything is all configured, and then we're going to go back through and just try and recap everything that we've discussed here in the last 45 minutes. We have some audience now, so it'll be useful information. To start off, just get your Heidi open and load up your spell template. You can pick any spell that you want, or just use whatever's currently listed. We're taking a look at Trapper's Net, but I'll actually move to a different spell, one that's default vanilla, so we can all examine it. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to have to go through the whole spiel about the tournaments and all the announcements. We're going to take a 5-minute break and smoke a cig real quick, though, and then we're going to dive on in. Alright, we're back. Let's dive into it. We have our spell template loaded. We're going to recap from where we left off last week. We're going to discuss the rest of the columns within spell template just so we can get that out of the way, and then we're going to discuss some of the other tables within VMaNGOS that are used, along with the DBCs. Again, my name is Wall. Thank you for tuning in. Just to recap what I had stated earlier, unfortunately, again, my mic was muted, but the Wallcraft tournaments that take place on the last Saturday of each month going forward, I likely will offer player in-game housing as the reward, just because people keep turning down the cash prizes for whatever reason. In-game housing, of course, that is rewarded through the tournaments and is obtainable in-game is fully tradable to other players. I want players to be able to dictate the market within the game and treat it like virtual real estate that they own. So if you win a tournament, you get a free house, and it could definitely help you out in the long run because you can trade houses to players for stuff in game. You know, it's your own house. Of course, they have the same amenities as all the other houses. The houses that will be offered for the tournament will be pre-existing houses that are empty in game that will be converted into player housing. The Patreon supporters will get, of course, the private and race area housing. Those likely will not be tradable because they're tied to the Patreon and they're custom. So just due to logistics, really. Like if a player has a house and then they cancel their Patreon or they quit the game, then there's a house abandoned, and you know somehow I have to deal with that. So tying the custom houses to the Patreon is a little bit more convenient for me. But the pre-existing in-game houses will be delegated by players through the Wallcraft job system. Wallcraft job system will essentially empower players to handle different functions that would consume a lot of my time in game. I'll just delegate those off to players. The big one right now is the real estate market. I'll have offices open within Stormwind and Orgrimmar where players can essentially work at the front desk handling different logistical things for the housing, trading it, brokering deals, selling houses, buying houses, whatever. Between players that'll be delegated through the housing markets in-game, and all the paperwork and stuff handled by whoever's working the job that day. So yeah, either way, let's dive right back into the lesson. We're going to start up. We're going to open up our solution file and Heidi. But for now, we're just going to be taking a look at Heidi as we go through the columns here. I'm going to try and fly through this real quick, though, for the columns on the spell template, because it's where we left off last week, and I'd like to get another hour and a half, at least, within this lesson plan. So, leaving off from last week, we had gotten all the way up about halfway through in the spell template, discussing the various flags and modifiers for the spell. And now we're digging into the juicy part of the spell, which is the actual effects and auras and different modifiers. So we're going to go about halfway through the spell template, and I'm going to just search for Frostbolt as our example today. We'll be using Frostbolt. I just got done talking about trappers and that for the last 45 minutes, but I decided we're going to do Frostbolt instead now. Just for convenience, because it's a default vanilla spell, so we can all look along with the same thing. We're going to take a look at Frostbolt entry 28478 in particular. That's the one we're going to be using for our example. So if you search Frostbolt, just make sure that you're taking a look at this row here, 28478. Now, I'm not certain what exactly this Frostbolt version is, if it's a player version. Probably not, actually, taking a look at it. We can see that seems to be an outlier here. It's probably an NPC version of the spell. So that's fine, though. We're still going to take a look at it, determine exactly what it does. Going back through, though, we're going to go about halfway through the spell template to the effects column and everything beyond that. We're going to start discussing. The effect column determines exactly what the spell does. You'll see three different effect columns. Each spell within vanilla World of Warcraft can contain up to 3 individual effects. For an example, Frostbolt, this will apply a slow and deal damage. The damage is dealt through effect 2, and the slow is dealt through effect 6. Now, to find out what those effects exactly are, because these are just entries within the enumeration, we're going to have to open up our solution file, and we're going to go to the spelldefines.h. So you can just search up in your Explorer bar, just search, if you search spell, you'll see all the files that contain definitions and modifiers for spells. Our focus today is going to be on spell defines, and we're also going to take a look at spell aura defines. So let's load up spelldefines.h, which is our header file. And you can see we're already open up to the spell effects enumeration. Spell effects are enumerated within spell defines, and you'll see all the effects listed. For Frostbolt, effect school damage is effect number 2. So it'll deal a certain amount of damage, which you can tell this is an NPC spell because the die is over 2,000, so it has a variance of 2,000 within the cast. This Frostbolt version probably does like 5,000. It's probably cast by like Kel'Thuzad or something. And the second effect listed here is an aura. If we pull up our header file, you can see spell effect apply aura is number 6. This is the one you're probably going to become most familiar with. Anytime a spell has to apply an aura or persistent effect, persistent effects are primarily handled through auras in-game and the aura system, even if they're not visible to the players. It's typically handled through an aura. So this effect will apply an aura, and we'll go through and see exactly what this aura is going to do. Moving on to the next columns beyond effect definitions is the die sides. Die sides determines the variable rolls of damage spells. So this spell has 21, 25 for die sides. That's a lot of die sides. That means that there's a lot of variance in damage. Again, this is a boss spell. Typically, you'll only see something like 51 for high-rank Frostbolt that's cast by a player. Something like that. Die sides typically will have a value listed of 1, regardless if it does have any variance, because of the way that the base points, which we'll discuss in a second, function. Even if the effect doesn't have any type of die rolls, like if it's just a flat-out aura application, it still will typically have 1 in the die side and 1 in the base die. And that's just like a standard that they have for a while. This does affect the base points, though, which is why you'll often see -1 in the base points, because if effect is not supposed to apply any damage or anything like that, then you'll see the modifier there, but with a -1 in the base point, it then decrements it, because adding any die sides, or base die I should say, will increment the base points, which we'll discuss in a second. For now, though, all we need to know is that die sides is typically used for damage rolls, and base die defines essentially what the base die can be, and that'll be basically added onto the base points. And again, you'll see things like die side 1, die side 2, die side 3, and then base dice 1, base dice 2, base dice 3. These define the specific effects. So die side 1 would affect effect 1, die side 2 would affect effect 2, etc. So we're going to be taking a look at the die side for effect 1, which is the damage portion of the Frostbolt spell used. But it's base dice and die sides. Dice per level defines that a spell scales in damage per level. Again, this is also handled with the spell level itself and the max level defined within the spell. But the dice per level increases the variance as well per level. And moving on to the next columns, real points per level, you'll see essentially various modifiers per level of spell, and this will change based on the character's level, and this defines how the damage roll or whatever roll is being handled should be handled based on the player's level. So Frostbolt, you'll see that it has real points per level listed, and that's because the effect modifier changes with the player's level, the spell level. Now on to base points. Base points is the definition for the amount of base points that are handled within this. You'll see you'll see for this spell, the first example that we're taking a look at is the Frostbolt used by Kel'Thuzad 28478, which actually has the damage effect before the slow. Player Frostbolts, you'll see that the aura for the slow is applied before damage, which is actually better in some ways than applying it because of how the core handles spell effects in order. So for this, you'll see base points 1, 7, 4, 3, 7, which means that this spell can hit very, very hard, and it has a high variance. So the Frostbolt from whatever mob is casting this, I assume it's Kel'Thuzad, will do some hefty damage. And then it also has a base points of -66. This references... did not mean to click that. This base points of -66 references the slowing effect, which is the aura that's applied by Frostbolt, and we'll later look at the exact aura definitions. But base points of -66 means that this slows players by 65%. Now you might ask, why is it -66 if it's slowing them by 65? And that's because we have base dice as a factor here. Anytime you have base dice, it will increment the base points. So, which is why you'll often see when you're looking through the spell templates, base points of -1 and that's because it's defining it as 0, but because there's a dice involved, or base die, of 1, then it increments it by 1, so we'll have to use -1 instead of 0, because otherwise it would be 1. And obviously this doesn't have any effect 3, it just does damage at a slow, so nothing in base points 3. Moving on to the next column though, bonus coefficient. Coefficient defines how much the spell should scale based on the modifiers. So for Frostbolt, it scales with your spell power, and that's why it has a coefficient of varying levels for the player versions. You can see the player versions here. This is the, again, Kel'Thuzad version. Scales 1-to-1 with spell power. The player ones scale less at lower levels, and then it finally reaches a point where it just scales at max. If we take a look at this, what's this exact one? Oh, that's Frostbolt Volley, in fact. So this one here that I have highlighted, Frostbolt rank 10, we're going to scroll back. This will be the highest rank player-based Frostbolt spell that's able to be casted. You can see it has a coefficient of 0.814, which means it scales about 81% of your spell power. And this is why downranking, you don't want to use the lowest rank spell, you want to use the lowest rank with the max coefficient. So if I, for some reason, needed to downrank Frostbolt, just to conserve mana in a long boss fight, I would want to downrank it to rank 5 or higher, so that I'm getting my maximum spell power coefficient bonus to the spell. Anything lower would have a lower spell power coefficient and would deal significantly less damage. And in default vanilla, you'll see some spells have some weird mana cost based on the spell level. So some ranks are, you know, if you're familiar intimately with your own class, you'll know what rank is good to use. For Shaman, it's like Lightning Bolt rank 4 is when it begins scaling with max coefficient. So if you're going to downrank, you want to use 4 or higher, or whatever, I think it's 5, whatever. Coefficient, though, again, defines how much it's going to scale off that modifier that the spell is using. If this was a physical spell, and it had a coefficient of, you know, this number, then it would scale with that much attack power instead of spell power, because it's a physical spell. And the determiner for how the coefficient is handled, whether it's spell power or attack power, is through the spell schools. If this was a 0 school, that would be physical, so it would use attack power instead of spell power. Well, because this is school 4, this is Frost, it's going to use spell power. So going back to coefficient column, you'll see often -1, that's a default value for coefficient. That doesn't mean that it negatively scales, it just means it doesn't have any modifiers for it. -1 because we don't have any effect in effect 3, so bonus coefficient 3 has -1 because it's just unused, and that's the default value for the column. Moving on to the next one, you'll see mechanic. Mechanics are defined within the spell defines header file within our solution. And the mechanic listed here doesn't actually affect what the spell does. It simply affects how the core handles the spell. So because we have an effect 11 listed here, which if we take a look here, mechanic, the enumeration for spell mechanics is listed here. Effect 11 would be a snare, which is actually a slow. That's what snare is called within vanilla, is slow, or slows are called as snare. So if mechanic 11 is present, that means that we will have to understand that the core will handle that based on that mechanic. The mechanic itself for the spell is defined within the aura, so the spell will apply the slow regardless of if the mechanic field is 0, but the game core will not handle it as a slow spell. It'll just let it pass. If we have mechanic 11, snare, that means that this spell, despite it being able to just slow, won't affect bosses, because bosses are immune to the mechanic of snare. This is what makes spells like Blackblade of Sharam slow proc very powerful, because it doesn't have a mechanic listed. Even though it's a slow, it doesn't have, you know, the snare mechanic listed in this field. So the game doesn't treat it like a snare, it just applies the aura, regardless of any rules that might be a prerequisite, which is why the Black Blade of Sharam's slow proc can affect raid bosses. Same with Trapper's Net, because there's no mechanic present. And that's essentially how you determine how the core is going to handle that mechanic specifically. So we can see we have effect mechanic 1 for the slowing effect, and obviously there's no other mechanics. You don't use mechanics for anything that's not really considered detrimental for negative status. You can see as we look through the enumerations, different effect mechanics that can be present. There's 30 plus a custom one for Curse of Tongues that's used. Various different effects. You'll see knockout, that's actually like the same as stun, but because the core will differentiate different types of stuns. Some stuns can affect certain things and some can't. That's how you separate them, by using 2 different categories. Let me take a look through chat here and see what's happening. Okay, Mason Fabian says, what's a simple definition of an aura? Is it really generic? We'll get to auras in a second, but for now we're just, all we've talked about for the auras is the effect itself, which is enumerated within the apply aura. Spell effect number 6, this is one that you're going to become very familiar with because it's like the most used, where a spell just applies some sort of aura. The specific auras are defined within the spell aura defines header. So if we'll take a look at that in a second. Mason also asked, weird, so you can set base dice to 0. Yes, you can set base dice to 0, but it's typically you'll use base dice of 1 within the effect if it has any type of rolls that are actually being committed. If it's just applying an aura, then you don't need base dice. Let's say it's what's a good example? Let's say it's polymorph. Polymorph wouldn't need a base dice because there's nothing being rolled. Base dice doesn't affect hit chance or anything like that, or resistance. It's just primarily used for damage rolls. Ever Jr. says spell description should have a bonus coefficient description. Can you modify it not just spell power, attack power, but by example strength? Yes, you can modify spells to scale off of different things, but you have to do that within the core, which means adding the code within the core and then recompiling it. By default, vanilla just determines how the spell is scaled based on the school. So if it's physical, it'll be attack power, or if it's spell, it'll use spell power. This is a spell school 4 of Frost, so it's going to scale with spell power. If it was an ability like Rend, I should use a better example, an ability like Mortal Strike, it would use the attack power because the school is defined as physical. The core determines what to scale it with based on that school definition. There are some spells that do scale off of different things that aren't attack power or spell power. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head in vanilla, but a good example in Wallcraft is Holy Shock. Holy Shock, in fact I'll pull it up right here in the core. Holy Shock. Let's see. Okay, over here. So you can see Holy Shock has different damage and healing depending on the equipment worn. And depending on what you're wearing in your offhand, it'll essentially decide whether it scales from armor, whether it scales from spell power, or whether it scales from healing bonus done. So, essentially spell power also calculates into this, but raw healing bonus, plus healing. Holy Shock in Wallcraft, again, scales depending on what you're wielding in your offhand. So if you're wielding a two-hander, it'll scale with your attack power. If you're wielding a shield, it'll scale with your armor. If you're wearing a buckler, it'll scale with your damage, your spell damage. And if you're wearing a focus, which is, an offhand frill, it'll scale with your healing bonus. So the spell is very flexible depending on what your equipment worn is. If you're a tank, you don't need to stack spell power to make Holy Shock good. You stack armor. If you're a DPS using a two-hander, you'd stack attack power, and the Holy Shock would scale from that then. It's not handled by default. You would have to add something like this to your core specifically for that spell. You can see that we have that handled within spell effects, C++ file. There's a few different other places too where it's checked. Also in spell effects in a different portion for healing effects. Spell effect heal and spell effect damage each need their own definition. Ever Junior asks, why does effect mechanic 1 is snare, meanwhile your slow effect on Frostbolt is on spell effect 1? That's because the Kel'Thuzad version of Frostbolt actually has these flipped for spell effects. If we look at the player version, the aura is effect 1 and the damage is effect 2. For the Kel'Thuzad version of the Frostbolt, it's damage first and then aura. So you just correspond that to what the effect number is in that position. For mechanic, because the player version has effect mechanic in 1, the reason that it does is because the aura is effect 1 for the player versions. And Ever Junior also asks, is there an option to retroport or just add new spell effects into VMaNGOS? Yes, you just add spell effects directly within the core. If we go to our spelldefines.h file, where is it? Did I close it? Yeah, I must have. If you go to spelldefines.h, you can see Wallcraft has some custom effects. There's a few that are custom used by VMaNGOS. These are, for the most part, deprecated, but Britannia keeps them in because there are a few effects that do need them. Wallcraft has one additional effect, which is Feral Leap. I do plan on adding more in the future, but there's already... most bases are already covered with the spell effects. Feral Leap doesn't exist in vanilla. The spell itself exists, but it was never coded by the developers in WoW, which is why it doesn't work in vanilla. If you're a GM, you can learn the Feral Leap spell because it does exist in the core, but or in the client, but it doesn't do anything because the effect isn't actually scripted and it doesn't have a specific definition. The way that Feral Leap in the default vanilla version that was never introduced into the game works, the one that's within the game files, it's actually a blink effect, so it's kind of like a teleport almost. The Wallcraft version obviously has like the Feral Leap jump forward kind of effect, so I had to create a new spell effect for that. Ever Junior asks, why not add spell effects from further expansions? I would if I needed them, but I don't. If I was adding different spells from different expansions, but most of them are handled with other spell effects. So if there was a need, I would, but I haven't come across the need yet. You know, you do it on a as needed basis, basically. I could backport all of the spell effects just so I have them there available, but if I'm not going to use them, then what's the point of bloating it up? Back to the table, though. We were taking a look at mechanics, so that's the definition of mechanics. Affect implicit targets are going to be the next 6 columns here. You're going to see affect implicit target A and affect implicit target B for each of the effects. This is because some targets, they're very binary, like Frostbolt, it just hits the enemy directly. Some effects will have secondary targets, such as, let's say, for example, a spell that teleports all friendly players around you to a target destination. Well, that would use 2 different targets. It would target all of the players around you, and then it would target the destination. Effect targets can be found within your spell defines, right at the top, actually. And you can see all the enumerations for this. Effect implicit target 6 is hostile enemy, so target unit enemy, and this is how it would apply to both the slow and the damage. They both target the enemy. If I were to change this to 1, I could make one of the effects target myself. Like if I cast Frostbolt, I could slow myself if I change this to target 1. It would slow myself, or if I change the damage 1, I could actually make it slow the enemy, but damage me. Which, obviously, is kind of stupid. Why would you do that? But some some spells, they'll simultaneously target an enemy and target you, or have different, targeting rules. Typically, you'll only use the effect implicit target A, but target effects that target destinations and locations typically will have both A and B. So those are the targeting rules. This is also handled too with earlier on in the table we saw the targets field. Targets defines how the targeting system functions. That uses flags. As an example, grenades have targets of 64, which would be 40. And that's because it opens up a targeting reticle targeting a specific area. The width, or the radius, I should say, is defined, though, within the target radius. So we go over here to spell targets, and you can see actually that's the next set of columns is spell radius. Obviously, Frostbolt doesn't have a radius, but if we were to search Blizzard, we would see the radius listed here. Radius will be listed as an entry from spellradius.dbc. So if you go into your 5875 folder, you can open up spell radius, and you'll see all the definitions for the different radiuses. In fact, we'll take a look at Iron Grenade real quick. See what the radius is. So Iron Grenade has an effect radius of 15 for both the stun and the damage, because obviously they both occur in the same area. So if we were to take a look at entry 15, it means Iron Grenade would have a radius of 3. The radius per level column is not actually utilized in any spells in vanilla. I'll eventually add a few more that will probably utilize this column, so that there's some cool new effects. But the radius and the radius max are, for vanilla, they're all the same. There's no differentiation between them. So Iron Grenade obviously targets a radius, and it's a radius of 3 yards, which is entry 15 within the spell radius DBC. And the reason that we have to look this definition up in the DBC is because there are many tables that are cached when you boot the server up, because they contain definitions like spell radius and stuff like that. And those do not change at all after the server is booted up. You're not going to have any, nothing new or nothing removed from this. So it just needs to load the definitions. With older versions of VMaNGOS or different emulators, you might see DBCs handled directly within the database, but it's rather unnecessary because we can just cache all that information directly from the client files and don't need that information in the database cluttering it up. It's always best to keep things as clean as possible. Moving on to the next set of columns, apply aura name. This set of columns is used if you are applying an aura through an effect, and obviously you can see, we'll go back to Frostbolt. Frostbolt, we'll take a look at the player ones, which are, if you search Frostbolt, you'll see 116 as rank 1 player Frostbolt. So we're going to take a look at that in our example now. The rank 1 player Frostbolt applies an aura of 33 for the first effect. The first effect for the player version is the slow aura. So obviously we can safely assume that that's going to be the slow aura, but let's just confirm, obviously. So Frostbolt will apply... Oh, I'm looking on the wrong table here. Frostbolt applies Aura 33. The definitions for auras are contained within spell aura defines.h, which is the header file for spell auras. Spell aura 33 mod decrease speed, which would be our slowing effect. So Frostbolt applies a slowing aura and then does damage for the player's effect, which is why it's a little bit superior than the NPC version, which applies the effect first, because that changes the way that the game rolls the effects based on resistances and hit chance, stuff like that. So, because we have an aura from effect 1, we're going to need to define what the aura does, and that is handled in this set of columns here. Obviously, there's no aura applied from the damage itself. just slow that's applied by the spell, and then it does damage, so there's no aura for 2, and then 3 is just not used for Frostbolt. There's only 2 different effects. Ever Junior asks, so to add new spell effect, it is enough to only modify spell definition.h. No, you actually need to figure out where you need to put it in the core. Spell definition.h is just a header file that contains definitions that are used by the other spell files. If we wanted to, let's say, add an entirely new effect, I can't think of an example that would be specific to later expansions outside of vanilla, but we'll just say, some sort of effect. If we wanted to add a new one, we would have to define it within the header file, and then we would have to actually add the scripting for it into one of the other spell files, which would be one of the CPP files, which would be like spell or spellcaster, spell effects, stuff like that. If we look at the Feral Leap spell that we added, we defined it within spell defines as effect 134. Oh, we can actually take a look here. Find all references, spell effect Feral Leap. My bad, actually, we'll have to find the... Okay. So, for the Feral Leap spell, we have it defined within our header file, and that's so the database numbers actually mean something. And then we implement the effect through various files, C++ files. One of them would be unit. So the Feral Leap effect is defined within unit.cpp. This is what affects the actual player's motion with that. You can see the spell effects Feral Leap, because it will essentially trigger a spell effect from the Feral Leap cast, which is 134, and that is effect Feral Leap. And then it will use the unit function of Feral Leap. So the effect will trigger, it'll carry out the checks depending on the player casting it. So if there's no unit target, which basically it says if I don't exist, I can't actually cast the spell. The reason that these checks are included, because if they weren't, the game would crash if something like that were to occur. So if there's no target, if I'm flying on a taxi, if I'm rooted, or if I have aura state falling, then it will not work. It'll return. Return basically says, alright, just go back. So if these checks all pass, then it won't return. It'll continue on to the next part of the code, which will cause me, the unit target, which is me, to use the Feral Leap ability, which is defined within unit Feral Leap. And you can see the different function overloads here. I'm sorry, whatever they're called. The Feral Leap effect will explicitly target the world object of the caster, which is me. It will float the horizontal speed based on the spell's effect miscellaneous value, divided by 10. And it will float the vertical speed based on the damage, divided by 10. Damage would be base points, so misc value and base points affect both the vertical and horizontal speed of Feral Leap. So that's how we created that spell effect, was all of this fun stuff. But looking at it, you can see where it's all defined. I have to define within the header file for unit and within the header file of spell the effect, and then I add the effect to the C++ files corresponding to that. Going back to the database here, we just discussed the aura. Effect Amplitude. Amplitude determines how often it triggers. This is used for damage over time spells and stuff like that. It's handled in milliseconds, so for an example, Shadow Word Pain ticks every 3 seconds or whatever. This would be 3000 in the amplitude for Shadow Word Pain. We'll take a look here. Shadow Word Pain. Effect amplitude of 3000, so every 3 seconds it will tick and apply the effect number 1 every 3 seconds. Effect number 1, obviously, for Shadow Word Paint is just going to be damage, so every 3 seconds it'll trigger that effect. Going back to Frostbolt, obviously there's no repeatedly triggering things from Frostbolt, it just applies the slow and the damage. So there is no Amplitude Fireball for the damage over time component. The aura would have an amplitude effect of whatever it is for the tick rate on Fireball, damage over time effect. But yeah, so like Frostbolt doesn't use any amplitudes, so we don't need any definers in there. Multiple values. Effect multiple value is... I actually cannot remember what this column does for the life of me, and there's no defines on it. Effect multiple value is for some sort of multiplier. I actually don't know where it's used in the database here. Let me try and find one that does. There's one right there. Okay, so what is this? Tentacle. Okay, Tentacle Call. Summons a Vanquished Tentacle. This is the Cthulhu Tentacle Trinket. And it has a multiple value of -28. I'm assuming that this is handled almost on a spell-by-spell basis, but these 3 columns, I'm not too certain. I don't think I've ever used them myself. You can see that there's only 50 spells that actually have it out of 30,000. These seem to all be handling summons, so multiple value is very likely related to some sort of summon effect. I'm not too privy on what this exactly pertains to, though. So if I don't know it, you probably won't need to either. Chain target. This is used for spells that have chaining rules, like chain lightning, chain heal, stuff like that. This will define how many targets it's supposed to bounce up to. If you have a chain target of 2, it will bounce up to 2 additional targets, etc. This is, again, defined for each spell effect. So if I had a spell that did both damage and applied a debuff, I would have to obviously incorporate the chain for all the effects, all the relevant effects that need to chain. Effect item type will affect the this is a weird one too, because effect item type is handled on a case-by-case basis depending on the spell effect. I'll remove the sorting from this. And effect item type. So, for example, a spell like a crafting spell, when you make something at an anvil, you're actually casting a crafting spell, obviously. This will define what the craft is supposed to spit out for like a crafting spell. Again, item type can change depending on the effect. They'll have to reference within the core. Usually you'll see it within the core, like it'll look for that field depending on the specific spell effect. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis on this, but typically it pertains to some sort of item involved within the spell or created by the spell. Misc value. This is another one that is variable depending on the effect. Miscellaneous value, for example, for Feral Leap, misc value defines the horizontal flight speed, or jump speed, or vertical, I can't remember which one exactly. Okay, so it'd be vertical speed for the misc value. This is, again, another variable set of columns for misc value that will change depending on the spell effect. It can be a little hard to get used to, but once you kind of figure it out, you'll understand like where misc value comes in. Another good example of this misc value is spells that pertain to specific effects. Hold on, let me pull up an example here. Spell mod. We'll see. Somewhere in here. Okay, spell mod. So let's say I have a talent that increases the damage of another ability. It would have an entry within the misc field, effect misc value. It would have an entry indicating that the damage is increased, which is actually 0. Let's say I have a talent that when learned, when I know the talent, it increases the duration of Shadow Word Pain by 3 seconds, which would be 1 tick. This would have to have 1 defined in miscellaneous value for the modifier of the effect, so that the core knows exactly what I'm trying to change with that. So you'll see all the different modifiers listed here. You'll often see, too, within the enumerations that it'll have max listed, and this is so it doesn't create some sort of overflow on it and crash the server. So anything above 29 would just be ignored entirely. That's miss value. Again, these three, or these few, multiple item type, misc value, these are very dependent on the specific effect. So we're not going to dive too deeply into those because that's a lot to talk about for each effect, but you kind of get the gist of it. Depending on the thing that you're trying to modify, you'll see different misc values and stuff. Again, my biggest advice too is if you are going to create a new spell, the best thing you can do is find a spell that exists that is very similar or very close, or even just exactly what you're trying to do, and copy that spell and modify it, or at least examine the effects and how the spell works. If I wanted to copy a spell like Improved Rend, which increases the damage and the duration, I would take a look at the another talent or spell that has similar effects, and I can kind of see what they do. But moving on to the next stuff, effect trigger spell is used for a specific spell effect that triggers spells. Some spells trigger other spells, and that's how that's handled, is with that column. If we look trigger, find the spell effect, trigger. Okay, so spell effect 64. If we had a spell effect of 64, it would trigger whatever spell is listed within this field. So you'll find a lot of spells that will trigger different spells. In fact, let's take a look at this one, whatever this is. Summon Fellsteed. This is the trainer spell. You can tell it's a trainer spell because of a visual of 107, which is the visual that gets applied when you learn a spell, that little golden glow around your character. Anytime you see spell visual 107, it is 99.9% of the time it's a trainer spell. So it's a very good way to determine what spell. Because if I search, let's say, Frostbolt, I'm going to get 50 different types of Frostbolts. Well, some of them aren't actually Frostbolts, they're just the trainer spells for Frostbolt. So, spell visual 107, this is the trainer spell for rank 10 Frostbolt. And this is because the trainers, the NPC trainers, they have a different spell than the actual spell. If they just had Frostbolt listed in their trainer template, it wouldn't work, because then the game would think that they're just trying to cast Frostbolt. Training spells are entirely separate spells. So basically, anytime you add a spell that needs to be learned from a trainer by the player, then you have to add a separate trainer spell for it as well. And then you add that trainer spell to the trainer, who will trigger the spell that's listed in the trigger field. So if we were to learn this spell right here, Frostbolt rank 10 is a trainer spell, because we can see the spell visual of 107. That would trigger spell 10181, which is Frostbolt rank 10, teaching it to the player. So this is what trigger spell is typically used for, is a lot of trainer spells, but again, other spells that trigger other spells. Effect 64 particularly will implement this. Another good example is Flash of Light. The Paladin spell actually triggers a different spell to commit the healing, which is why some people, they complain, oh, why can I cast Flash of Light on a dead body? That was a bug that existed in VMaNGOS for a long time. It's because Flash of Light is actually triggering a different spell, so it has different rules for the spell checks on that. And for quite some time, there was just an error where it wasn't checking if the target was a corpse before triggering the spell. I believe that's been corrected since. I fixed it on Everlook. I don't know if it ever got upstreamed. I can't remember if I included that. Moving on to the next set of columns, effect points per combo point. These are used for combo point abilities. And let's say like a Rogue's Eviscerate ability. This would have different values based on the amount of combo points. So let's say this Eviscerate spell did 100 more damage per combo point. We would have 100 in here. And that's how the core determines how it should scale based on the amount of combo points that are expended when using the ability. We're almost at the end of the spell template. And again, this is spell visual. This is the entry from the spell visual DBC file. Since visuals are handled strictly client side, it'll have the definition within the core, but or it'll have the number within the core for the spell, but the definition is held within the DBC, which is entirely client side. That's why you can modify, you know, models and spell visuals and stuff like that in your client. So, spell visual 107. Obviously, there's a lot of different spell visuals in the game. There's about 8,000 plus all the ones that I have custom added. Effect 107 though is the most common one that you'll see. Again, 107 is a trainer, so if you see spell visual with 107 and spell visual 1, you can just pretty safely assume that's a trainer spell. There's only 2 different spell visual for a spell, and typically visual 2 is not used. I actually don't even know if it's used at all. It might be. Let me take a look. No, spell visual 2 is actually not even... Oh, is it? Let's see. We got one. Okay, so there's 2 different spells that have a spell visual. Seal of Justice and Sire's Suicide. I actually don't know if Seal of Justice should have this. I think this is a Wallcraft. Yeah, this is a Wallcraft custom one, so this shouldn't even have a spell visual 2. Sire's Suicide, I actually don't know what casts this spell. I can find out through Classic DB. Searching creature spell lists, but I'm guessing this is some NPC quest spell. Yeah, it's an instant kill. Probably has a visual for both the caster and the target, something like that, or on the ground. You can assign multiple visuals through this, but it's only used for one spell in default vanilla. I actually don't even need this for Seal of Justice. I should remove it, but I'll worry about that later. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess, you know? Spell icon ID defines the icon that's used for the spell. One thing to note is to be a bit careful how you're defining the spell icon, because the core often references the spell icon and how it should handle spells. It'll search for the spell icon. And the reason for this is like the warrior class, or any class really, but just as an example, the warrior class has Whirlwind ability, which has an icon that's shared by many other things, but the spell family of warrior spells only has one usage of that icon. So if I wanted to reference Whirlwind and all ranks of Whirlwind, let's say I had a talent that made Whirlwind proc something. Well, instead of adding entries for every single instance of that spell Whirlwind, which to the core is a very bad standard for programming, because if, let's say I added a new version later, then I would have to update and recompile the core. A very simple trick that's often used in VMaNGOS is to simply reference both spell family and spell icon, primarily because there are not many spell families like Druid or Rogue or whatever class that will have multiple spells with the same icon that are, you know, fundamentally different spells outside of ranks. So if I wanted to add a talent that would trigger something off of, let's say, Warrior's Whirlwind to the Arms talent tree, or Fury talent tree, I should say, I wouldn't want to obviously add all the entries. A very simple hack is to just reference the spell icon and the family name. And the reason that we also reference the family name is because that spell icon is used elsewhere, so if I just reference the spell icon, then that talent would trigger every time I used the axe from Scarlet Monastery, the effect off of that buff is the same icon. You'll see too in VMaNGOS, there's still some work to do. So there's a few things that weren't working correctly recently. I think one notable example that I actually fixed, I don't know if it got upstreamed, but I fixed it a while ago and posted some of the fixes for it on VMaNGOS, is Power of the Guardian, which is the Atish aura. Atish aura prior wasn't stacking with Boomkin aura because they both share the same spell icon, and Boomkin aura doesn't have a spell family defined to it. It just uses the generic 0 spell family. So because of the stacking rules within the core, those two spells, because they share the same icon, they cannot stack. That's typically how spell stacking rules are defined, is by the icon of the spell and the spell family. Well, since they both share the same family, a specific rule for an exception on the stacking of those two spells had to be added to the core, which is what I did. Moonkin, or you can find when I added that rule. Wallcraft, Moonkin, Aura, and Power of the Guardian. That's handled in Spell Manager, which handles various spells and auras and their application. You can see some of the other examples, like Wallcraft, Moonkin Aura, and Power of the Guardian for Atish Aura. They both stack. The Garrote from Rogue and Garrote Silence, which actually doesn't exist in Vanilla. This is a TBC thing, but it will exist in Wallcraft. I just haven't added the Silence component. Those both stack. That's often, too, you'll see it on spells that apply an additional effect through the talent. The talent itself might share the same icon and spell family. So, trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, and I think Garrote would be a clean example here. Most people are familiar with that in, I think, TBC onwards. There's a talent for Garrote that applies a Silence. Well, the Silence itself has the same icon as Garrote, and because you can't stack multiple Garrotes off of one player, the core needs a specific rule to handle that. So that's the spell icon. It's very self-explanatory. Just be careful when using spell icons, because you need to know. I've had this happen to me a few times where I've added a spell icon and then the spell doesn't work right, and it's because somewhere in the core it's checking that spell icon and it's applying different rules than I want. So I would have to either change the icon or change the rules that are used. A good solution too is if you're adding new custom spells that might share a pre-existing icon, just add a new entry to the spell icons DBC. We'll open up spell icons. So you'll see that I do this a few times, is that the spell icon might be the same, but it's actually listed under a new entry because it's pulling the entry, not like the physical image of the icon. It's defined within the entry. So yeah, you can see I have a few entries at the bottom here that are actually duplicates of pre-existing entries. And that's just to circumvent some of the core rules. Active icon ID is used for spells that have active icons. A good example is like shapeshifts, stuff like that. When you cast the spell, it's persistent and you can cancel it. Shadow Form is a good example. When you use Shadow Form, the icon of Shadow Form changes to that, like Arcane Explosion icon, basically. So that's what active icon ID is used for. If the spell is persistent and doesn't cancel until the user cancels it or whatever, or the icon, I should say, changes when the spell is active, then you would define the active icon ID in this column. Ever Jr. says, very strange actually to check spell icon for any spell script or spell effect. It does seem strange, but it's honestly, it's the most efficient way, simply because icons themselves are very well defined for each spell. Yeah, stealth is another good example. It's because spell icons are very unique, and in conjunction with spell family, they're even more unique, so it's a very, very easy way to check spells. It might seem sloppy, but it's actually a pretty good way of checking them. just because it's a very simple way to define it. Let's say I wanted, let's say I made a talent for a Frost Mage that added additional chilling effects to Frostbolt and no other ice spells. Well, how would I run that check? You know, am I going to use spell family flags? That's probably the most efficient way, is spell family flags. I could just define it as the Frostbolt, but the problem is, what if multiple spells share the same spell family flag? Let's say I had Ice Lance shared the same spell family flag as Frostbolt. Well, that talent would then affect Frostbolt and Ice Lance. A good example is the Wizardry talent in Wallcraft. Originally, I didn't intend it to reduce the cast time of Polymorph, just the conjuration spells and whatnot, and invisibility. But because there is a limited amount of bit values that I can use for the spell family flags, there's not actually enough to define new spells. So, again, a good example is Wizardry. To modify the casting time of mages' invisibility or their conjure food would affect all of their arcane spells because they all share the same family flag. So if I were to just use family flag or any other modifier, it would have some overlap. Spell icons are a really easy way to circumvent this because spell icons are very specific to the spells. If I wanted to use spell icons, though, for a defining check, it needs to be added to the core, which is the problem, because if I just use family flags, I can just handle it within the DBC directly, or the database directly. Whereas spell icons need to be checked in the core. But it's a very convenient, simple, and effective way of handling it. Scrolling back, spell priority. I'm actually not sure what this does, but I know spell priority has some impact, I believe, on batching. It's basically if two spells were to go off in the same batch, whatever has higher priority number will apply first for the other effect, which I believe might have had some bearing on that issue that we were experiencing previously on Everlook that I had fixed, where your the mage talent, the frost mage talent that causes the target to become frozen, like 15% chance to become frozen when they're affected by a frost spell, it was breaking when you cast Frostbolt because the spell priority wasn't set up right. I don't even know if spell priority currently functions within VMaNGOS, if it actually does anything, and that might be the reason why that there was an issue, because the spell priority for Frostbolt wasn't taking precedence over the Deep Freeze or whatever. So that's the reason why you would cast Frostbolt. It would proc the Ice Nova effect on the enemy, and then it would break instantly from the damage because the damage was applying after the effect and then being rolled against the the check for if it breaks or not on damage. Ever Jr. says spell icons does actually nothing but interface things. Aside from the rules and the checks in the core, that is fairly correct, which is why it is used, because it's kind of a client-side only thing, so it's not really impactful on anything else besides those checks that we're running off of it. So that's really what makes it the most effective, because it's not used outside of that. Name, very obvious, it's just a name. Just make sure that when you're entering any type of strings that have special characters, like apostrophe, you have to denote it with, again, special characters, otherwise it won't appear correctly. You can see, look for a spell with an apostrophe here. Trapper's not calling. So name is a string, which means you can just have an apostrophe. You don't need a special escape character. But description is different. You need a special character, essentially, to escape the apostrophe. Otherwise, it thinks that you are including an apostrophe in it, which, it's an escape character, and it'll break your spell, basically. It ends the line despite it not despite it not supposed to be ending from that. Mason asks, you already talked about targets, but is it possible to target specific player roles like healers? That is not... that's a tricky question. That's kind of a tough question. I'm not really certain the example that you're trying to think of. If you're talking like, if you have a spell that a player bot casts, or an NPC, let's say an NPC will only target a healer with the spell, that would be handled directly within the spell scripting, either database script or hard-coded script within the core to look for healers or people who are doing healing. There's no native function to only target specific things. You could add it, though. If I wanted a spell that only affected shamans within a certain AoE distance, I could add that to the core where it checks the players, and then it checks if they're shamans, and if it's not a shaman, then it just returns. So that's something you could add and have it work like that, but there's just no real need, simply because it's easier. For example, like a boss fight where he only targets a healer or something like that, or a cloth mana class, something like that. A good example is Ragnaros. Ragnaros is fire blasting that blasts people back and drains their mana or whatever. Only targets people who have a mana bar. That's handled within the scripting, not within the core functions that are used in the database. And that's just simply because it's just as easy to do that. You could add that target, but again, the big thing is VMaNGOS attempts to emulate vanilla using information from the vanilla client. Since it's not a function within the vanilla client, it doesn't get added to VMaNGOS. That would be like a Wallcraft custom thing if I were to do that. Going back to Frostbolt. Name flags. Don't worry about this. If you're copying spells, just copy whatever. Don't worry too much about that. This is mostly for localization, and if you're doing any custom stuff, just copy whatever's in there for your localization. This actually, I think this has some bearing on the way that the tooltips and icons are presented, but I don't really know where these flags are defined, and I've never noticed any type of difference, so I'm assuming it's just localization. Either way, just copy whatever's in another spell, and it'll work. Name subtext, this is used to define ranks, so like a spell, Frostbolt, it'll say rank whatever below it. If there's a rank, you'd use this field. It can be used for other stuff too, but typically it's just used for ranks. We'll find another one that's used for. Let's see. Okay, so like Eye of Kilrog, it says summon under the spell. Instead of like a rank, it just says summon, because it's a summon spell. So subtext is just a string that's on the tooltip there. Get rid of these sorts. Go back to Frostbolt. Michael Trevor says, good to see you all. Wish you were still on Everlook since you left. It went to poop. Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to see you. I do miss working on Everlook. I miss working with the community and, developing a really good server. And first 2 weeks of Everlook after launch was phenomenal. Everybody was having a great time. The server was running really well. No crashes, no bugs, no issues. Aside from like the minor, oh, this quest isn't working kind of thing. But, yeah, so it sucks to hear that the server is kind of shit now. I hear it's like a really high population, but it's like 80% Chinese, and a lot of botting, and a lot of cheating, and a lot of bugs and issues and stuff. And a lot of the work that I did too, I spent 6 months working on the server in the summer of last year, and all of the work that I've done, they basically undid to the dismay of a lot of players. I went through the bug tracker actually yesterday that they have running just to see what issues they have been facing. And a lot of people complaining about stuff like, hey, why isn't this working anymore? I was really happy it was working. It made the game better for me. Big example is like Shaman's, I think, Elemental Mastery. I had specifically designed it to, or not the elemental mastery, the clear casting, procking from spell damage procs, which is an old private server thing. It's not really vanilla, but it's an old private server thing. But it just like it made the class playable. Without that, the class is it's a meme spec. It's not actually playable. So like stuff like that, you know, people have been really disappointed about. But you know, what are you gonna do? It's how they want to run it. And it's one of those things where I really don't think they're interested in how fun or how good the server is, or how much people enjoy it. They really just want 8,000 Chinese people who are doing all sorts of shady stuff. Neither here nor there. Continuing on, name subtext flags. Same thing with the name flags. Don't really worry too much about it. Just copy whatever's existing. If you can't find a good one, try and find a similar spell. Like you'll see, Frostbolt changes its subtext flags between patches. Again, I think it's a localization thing. I really don't know what the definitions are for these, and they're not really seemingly relevant. Michael Trevor says, tons of bot, 90% Chinese. Chinese ruin AV by Alt-Q. I have yet to have a GM respond to a ticket over a month. Yeah, that's painful. I'm really sorry to hear that. When I was there, every day I banned maybe 200 bots and answered, for the first week, I answered maybe like 150 to 200 tickets a day. And we had no tickets in the queue while I was working there because I was just answering them all. But it's a lot of effort to answer tickets, and it sucks. But on the second week of the server launch, I was so busy doing other shit I couldn't even answer tickets, and I was getting yelled at constantly too. Well, you didn't file this ticket in this specific category, so it doesn't matter that you helped the player if you didn't file it correctly. So it's like all bureaucratic bullshit. And it's just like, okay, well, I'm just not going to answer tickets anymore. I don't care. It's not my job anyways. Ever Jr. says, does Everlook contribute into VMaNGOS bug fixes? They actually do. Meadow does a pretty good job at fixing some of the stuff over there, and he does upstream it to VMaNGOS, so I'm very appreciative of that. I got no bad blood to anybody on the staff over there. I did enjoy working with most people. Only two people I really had an issue with were the two people running the thing. But yeah, they do upstream fixes. You'll see through the VMaNGOS tracker, you can see some of the stuff comes from Everlook Team Everlook, I think is the account they use, or Neto. Neto typically contributes off his own personal account. But if you see it from Neto, it's because he fixed it on Everlook. Continuing on, description. Let me see actually how it's handled. I don't think it's a string. I think it's a varchar. Okay, so description is the one that you need to make sure that you are using escape characters for. So you'll see a lot of descriptions. Pull this back up. You'll see a lot of descriptions that will have like a backslash before an apostrophe. That's a way to avoid escape characters. If you don't have that backslash, then it will break the tooltip, basically. So if you are having issues with the tooltip, just make sure that you're kind of aware of that. You'll see in the descriptions that are often used, it'll use these, I don't know what they're called. I want to say variable, but they're not. It'll use like these flags for the fields that are being referenced. So you can see launches a bolt of frost at the enemy, causing $S2 frost damage and slowing movement by $S1% for $D. Might seem confusing, but S is referencing the base points, D references duration. So it's causing whatever is in the base points 2 column, or that field for that spell, is what will appear on the tooltip. And this is how tooltips are variable and how they change automatically. If you had a talent that increased the damage, the tooltip would change to reflect it. Well, it's because it uses these functions to pull the specific value. If I just had causes, you know, if I just put the number in for like 200 frost damage, well, that number wouldn't change if I modified it with talents or whatever. So you use these function. Yeah, I don't know what they'd actually be called. Not variables, not functions, whatever they are. Flags, I guess. Not even flags. That'd also be wrong, whatever they are. Stim says Stone Harry's spell editor has some documentation on what those things means and are for. I should actually check that. I'm sure he's got some good definitions on that. Typically I go to Google and I'll just Google the DBCs, and WoW Wiki dev page will sometimes have definitions, but it's not often complete because VMaNGOS is its own emulator. The tables are different for stuff like VMaNGOS. But yeah, I should definitely check it out because I'm sure Stone Harry has done a lot more descriptions and information on some of these things. And I'm sure name flags, because it's handled by the spell editor, obviously he has to have the enumerations listed somewhere. Description flags, same deal as the other flags for the names. You don't really have to worry too much about it, just copy something that works, that pre-exists on a different spell. And try and use spells from the same patch, or the latest patch, 5875, or even 5464. You can see that these actually did change. I think it's because they added another localization for the name flag. And I think that this just references the localization tables. Regardless, though, don't worry too much about them. Just include whatever, as long as it works. Aura description, same deal as description, but this is what the aura will state when you mouse over the aura icon, not the spell. So if I have the aura on me, then I'm slowed by a frostbolt, and I mouse over it, it says movement slowed by X. That's just the definition for the aura. Any spell that applies an aura should have an aura description. Some spells don't, but typically for aura descriptions, if they're applying an aura, you want some sort of description on the tooltip, so it's clear to players what it's exactly doing to them. Some spells won't have any information visible to the client because they're kind of hidden, so they don't even use slots in the aura bar. There's actually no limit to the amount of auras you can have. It's defined within the config file. You know, it's like typically in vanilla, late game vanilla, it's 32 auras and 16 debuffs, but you can actually have unlimited. It's just how many will display in the client. So a good trick is if you don't need to use an aura, or the aura doesn't need to be visible, don't, because it saves you the headache of aura slots in vanilla. Moving on though, mana cost percentage. This is how much percent mana the spell should cost. Again, we can define the mana cost as raw mana cost, or we can define it as percentage. Some spells cost a percentage of mana instead of a raw flat value. Many spells typically like to use raw flat values, but like for example, some spells will just cost percentage based on your current maximum mana. Not even current maximum mana, based on your maximum base value mana. So unequip all your gear, and whatever your base mana value is, that's the percentage that it's costing. Start recovery category is typically used for the global cooldown, which is why you'll see recovery category of 133. 133 category is global cooldown, and 1.5 seconds is the 1.5 second global cooldown off casting a spell. Some spells don't have a global cooldown. Some spells have shorter global cooldown, like rogue spells only have 1 second global cooldown instead of 1.5. This is actually, I think, one of the biggest things that I did to Warcraft's DPS rotations for classes, is some abilities have had their global cooldown removed, and that adds a lot better of a rotation because it gives you options of what to do. Vanilla is kind of simplistic in that you're restricted by a global cooldown, and typically you only have 1 or 2 spells that you're going to cast, and typically those are dictated by the current spell's cooldown. So the global cooldown doesn't really serve any purpose besides pacing out the timing of your abilities in a very generic way. A good example of this is like Paladin's Consecration. Doesn't have a global cooldown on Warcraft. A lot of warriors overpower, revenge, and Mocking Blow, which are like 3 generally the same type of abilities, but using different stances with different prerequisites to actually using them. Those abilities on Wallcraft have had their global cooldowns removed because I want them to be more reactive and create a little bit more complexity to the game combat system. So removing global cooldowns from specific spells was, I think, the biggest way to really push combat, because instead of just having a game of whack-a-mole where you're pushing the buttons as they come off cooldown, a lot of times I'll be playing like a warrior, a paladin, or a mage or whatever, and I have 5 buttons I can push right now. And it's like, okay, well, what one is the best for this very second that I'm casting? Do I want to use Crusader Strike? Do I want to use a Flash of Light with my Art of War proc? Do I want to use, Exorcism, stuff like that? Correct. Warrior's Shield Block didn't go on global cooldown. Paladin's Holy Shield did. I removed the global cooldown from Holy Shield to make it more in line with Warrior's Shield Block. Same with the other block abilities for the other classes. I'm just using Paladin as an example, but this was same treatment as kind of given to all classes. Specifically, like tanking abilities. Tanking abilities that are part of your standard defensive portion of your rotation have largely had their global cooldown stripped, because it feels really bad when you're doing your DPS rotation and it's like, oh, the boss is going to hit me. I have 1 second to get my Holy Shield up so I don't eat a crushing blow, but my global cooldown's up because I just used something. I used Consecration. So that's like a real feels bad. I went through and basically removed global cooldown off of defensive abilities that are part of the standard rotation for all tanking classes, because it gives a lot more nuance to the tanking rotation than just simply waiting for the button to light up. Yeah, reactive abilities using global cooldowns is honestly such shit game design, and that's why I removed it all. Like having to wait for a global cooldown on Revenge or Overpower, it really sucks. Like, it choosing your rotation, and when those reactives only have a short duration in which they're active, if my Overpower procs, and I can use Overpower now on the enemy, but my global cooldown just started, and the enemy is like running, I would only have, 2.5 seconds instead of 4 to actually use the ability, and I might not be able to hit them. So not having them on the global cooldown is way better for reactives and tanking abilities. So, but spell recovery categories, the start recovery category and start recovery time is typically used for global cooldowns. You can put other categories in here. For an example, Wallcraft totems for the Shaman class. Each totem has its own separate global cooldown category for each specific type. So Earth, Water, Air, and Fire each have their own separate global cooldowns based on the type. This means I can cast 4 different types of totems at once, but I have to wait the global cooldown to cast 2 different fire totems back to back. So it adds, again, there's a lot of nuance and complexity and depth that can be added to combat by adjusting the global cooldown system, specifically to suit the gameplay. The default vanilla one was really rudimentary. Moving on to the next columns, min target level. This is the minimum level that a target has to be affected by the spell. This is typically used for buff spells, not really damage spells or anything like that. Spells, obviously, damage spells can hit targets of any level for the most part. Like Blessing of, whatever. Like Divine Spirit, I think, is a good example. Divine Spirit can't be cast on a level 1 character. It needs to be used, let me actually take a look. Divine Spirit, it doesn't have a minimum target level. Minimum target level is also defined, same with kind of like mana cost, it's defined in the earlier portion of the spell template where it says spell level. So the spell level will automatically downrank based on the target's level. If there is no rank that suits that requirement, it'll just say the target's not high enough level. This field also is able to define that in a much more straightforward way. It's not really used very often, but if a spell has a specific minimum target level, this is a very good field to use it in. This is where you would put it. And max target level, same deal. Blessing of Sanctuary, I think that's also handled within the spell target level. Yeah. There's no min target level for that either because that's handled within spell level. So you can't cast Blessing of Sanctuary on somebody who's... Let's see, what's rank 1 here? You can't cast Blessing of Sanctuary on somebody who's under level 30. I believe it's 30 is the minimum level, and that's because the spell level is 30, and the base level is 30. If I, let's say, use Blessing of Might max rank on a level 1 player, it'll automatically down rank to the minimum. And I think that there's a range of variance off of the spell levels. It's not obviously level 1, because you can Blessing of Might a level 1 player. Yeah, minimum target level, like Ever Jr. says, is a good way to stop spells, specifically from gank or griefing low-level players. If you don't want a specific spell to affect anyone who's under level 20 or something, level 10, just to stop it from being abused and griefing. In default vanilla, it's not so much a case for any spell in-game that would exist, but in Wallcraft, a good example would be like the Dark Pact talent for Warlocks. If I don't want that affecting players under level whatever, then I would change the Curse of Agony or whatever to, or Corruption, I'm sorry, to only be able to affect specific target levels. But that's not typically utilized in any case. Let's see if there is even any usage of it. I'm sure there's probably a few spells that do. Nope. That column is actually not used for anything. Nope, it is. 4 spells have minimum target level. Okay, yeah, here's a good example. Furbog Medicine Pouch cannot be used by anyone who's under level 50 because it's an item spell. Okay, so that makes a little bit more sense why there's duplicate function, essentially. So, like, the spell level for spells that are player casted, that's what will handle it, but spells that are triggered from items obviously don't have multiple ranks, so it can't down rank, so they just define it with minimum target. So like Furbog Medicine Pouch, you can't use it if you're under level 50. Same deal with max target there. Now, spell family name and spell family flags. These are used to define which class the spell belongs to, and this categorizes it within that class. Spell family flags is used for spells which modify other spells. So again, going back to the example of a talent in Frost Tree that increases the damage of Frostbolt, let's just say. Or even better example would be a spell that... What can I even really say? Here, let me pull up an example. Okay. Spell class mask.h is the header file that will contain all the definitions for the spell family flags. We'll take a look here and we can see that Frostbolt has a spell family flag of 20 hex. It would be defined as 5, but we would use the decimal value, so we would convert the 20 to a decimal value. The Frostbolt, Frost Nova, Blizzard, Frost Ward, all of these, since they're flags defined within spell family flags, I can couple all of these flags together and include them for a talent that only affects these specific spells that I want. Which is why, again, there's like some issue with some spells having overlap with family flags because there's only a limited amount that you can have. You can only have 32 different entries because it's a 32-bit integer value that's used by the client. There are custom cases that are extended, but they are not used directly within the client. They're used specifically within the core because the client cannot define them. So let's say I have a talent that modifies, let's just say in theory I created a new talent that modified the damage of Shield Slam. I actually won't be able to get it to reflect on the tooltip in game that players can see because the client itself holds that value in a 32-bit unsigned integer, I believe. And because this is, you know, outside of that scope, outside of that range, The client cannot actually hold that data. You can use negative values for spell family flags, so yeah, it's unsigned integer, 32-bit unsigned integer. You can use the negative values for that within the database, but not the client. So if I have a talent that affects Shield Slam but doesn't need to be visibly updated in the client's tooltip, I just use this family flag, which obviously is the reason why it's there. Another few examples are like Siphon Life, Curse of Doom, Devour Magic, Spell Lock. These spells don't get modified visually within the client for their tooltips by anything, so it's fine if they can't be reflected within the client, but the core still needs to handle them, specifically using the family flags grouping. So like, if I have a Warlock talent that increases the range of all my channeled spells, well, to define what spells are specifically affected by that, it's not like I can just tell the core, well, all channeled spells that the Warlock has, because the core is like, well, what are those? I don't know what they are. So, the way that we define them as spell family flags. Warlock is a family of 5. Here, we'll use Mage, though, as an example. Mage is a family 3, and Frostbolt is a flag of 20. Well, what do we actually have here listed for Frostbolt? Because it could have multiple family flags, not just the Frostbolt one. It could have, other stuff, which obviously it seems to have. Spell family of 3, which is Mage, and spell family flags, which is this big old decimal that we have to convert. Rapid tables, and this is the site that I use for my conversions. And we're going to have to convert decimal to hexadecimal because it's stored in a decimal value. And we want to find out what the hex is. So we have a flag of 20, a flag of 80,000, flag of 100,000, and a flag of 40 million. So we see 20 is Frostbolt. Where am I? So 20, 80,000. Move this window back over. 20, 80,000, which is miscellaneous frost spells. 100,000, which is mage chilled frost spells with spell aura mod decrease. So any frost spells that have decrease effect, which is the chilled effect, Frostbolt and Frost Shield, contain this family flag. And the other one was 40 million. Should be the... Is that right? Conjure. Okay, so that's also grouped under conjuration spells. Huh. I actually need to check something. I think something might be wrong on Wallcraft there with that. No, there's no chance. Yeah, I want to make sure Wizardry isn't affecting Frostbolt, reducing the cast time by half. That'd be misattributed family flag used. Yeah, let me check the chat real quick. Okay. Moving on. That kind of gives us a brief overview of family flags. This is a very important field that we're going to use a lot for talents that modify other spells. That's how they're defined. In fact, let's take a look here. What is the mage talent that modifies Frostbolt? I can't remember what it's called exactly. Mage talent that would modify Frostbolt would be Ice Shards. Increases the critical damage bonus of your frost spells by 20%. So, Ice Shards would apply a modifier. So that would be the effect of 27. Persistent area. No, that's right. Planks. Okay, it's got to be this one. These are the 5 talent points here. It's applying an aura to me. That aura is 20, 40, 60, 80, and 100% critical strike damage bonus. The aura is 108, which is a percentage modifier. The spell mod, or spell misc value, is going to be 15, which defines critical strike chance, or critical strike damage bonus, I should say. And the affected item type is 736. That would be referencing the family flags of what is being affected. And again, that's why item type is variable. It's not affecting an item, it's affecting a spell, but that's where the data is held, in that column. So we convert 736, and what we get is 2E0. And because that's a hexadecimal value, we'll need to convert, or at least just know how to handle it, 2E0. So E would be Frostbolt, Frost Nova, Blizzard, Blizzard, Frost Nova, and Frostbolt. It's those three. And then Cone of Cold as well for 2E0. The way that hexadecimal work, it's again base 16. So because the number is 2E0, as seen when we convert, let me pull this over. When we convert 736 from decimal to hex, we get 2E0. That means that the flags will be it's base 16. So basically we have to add up values until we reach the letter E. And the way that works is it would go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. So to obtain an E, we know that F is basically the adding of all of the ones within that position. But since it's E and not F, it's excluding the 1. So 2, 4, and 8. If we add 2 to 8, that's an A, and then another 4, that's an E. So A, B, C, D, E, another 4. So 2E0 would be Cone of Cold, all the other frost spells. That's how the modifiers work. The data for the family flags is held in the item type. And obviously, misc value is defining what we're modifying with ice shards. Back to Frostbolt. Yeah, improved Frostbolt. Mason saying improved Frostbolt. We can take a look at improved Frostbolt. Improved Frostbolt. Look at the first rank. Reduces the casting time of your Frostbolt spell. So it's going to apply an aura to us, targeting us. The base points is going to be -101, which is -100. That's 0.1 second, because this is held in milliseconds when we're modifying time, casting time. It's not always milliseconds, but it is for the modification of casting time. 107 is going to be a flat modifier. 107 is flat modifier, 108 is percentage modifier for the spell auras that you can see in the defines. It's affecting 32, which you run that through rapid tables, and you'll get used to basically a lot of the numbers, but you notice that 32 is 20. So we check that in the family flags, and that is Frostbolt. So it is modifying Frostbolt, and the misc value is 10, which would be casting time. So improved Frostbolt applies an aura to us. The duration is infinite. You'll see duration 21, which references the index. Spell durations. Pull up spell duration index. Spell durations are held in DBC, not within the database. 21 is listed as -1. That means it's infinite. So it's a persistent aura that doesn't go away. And it applies to us. The target is 1, which is the caster. And it gives us a modified flat modifier. If this was 108, it would modify it by the percent, which obviously would give us 100% cooldown reduction. Obviously not right. Flat modifier of 0.1 second. And it affects Frostbolt. And misc value is the casting time. Let me go back to Frostbolt for the rest of the columns here. Max affected target is the maximum amount of targets that can be affected. This is typically used for AoE. Stuff like, and this is more so applicable to expansions after vanilla. There's no target cap for most AoE spells in vanilla, but like in TBC, Blizzard can only hit, I think, 10 targets at once. So it would have 10 max affected targets. Vanilla doesn't particularly have target caps on many things. There are a few spells that do have max affected targets, but yeah, for the most part, that's not utilized. Damage class defines what type of damage it's going to be. 0, I believe, is physical. 1 is magic. Prevention type, you would need magic immunity to prevent it. Stance bar order is spells that are stance spells or shapeshift spells. This is how you define what order they appear in the stance bar. You'll notice if you play Paladin, I actually rearranged all of the auras for Paladin. It might seem a little counterintuitive, but that's because there's a lot more auras. Basically the original alpha version of Paladin. So there's more auras than traditional in vanilla. So I rearranged them just to be a little bit more convenient with the new ones. Not just tack them all on the end. Damage multiplier is basically how much the damage the spell should do. Typically you'll just see this as 1. If there's, you can modify the multiplier to a different value if you do need. If I had this at 0.5, it would do half damage. If I had 2, it would do twice as much damage. This is basically determining the modifiers, but typically these fields will just be 1. Same with damage class and prevention type. You'll be very static on that. Minimum faction ID and minimum reputation. If a spell requires, or typically this is an item, not a spell, but if a spell requires you to have a certain reputation with a faction to actually use it, you would define the faction entry and then the amount of reputation required to use it. Oh, yeah, you're actually right, Thims. Thims says he thinks this is for chaining. Actually, yeah, he is correct on that. Damage multiplier can be used for spells that chain to multiply the damage or decrease the damage. In fact, let's take a look. Sir Zeliek's chain, I believe, or Cthulhu's I-beam, I think, increases with every hit, every target that's hit. I can't remember what that spell is exactly called, but we'll take a look at Chain Lightning. The damage multiplier. Yeah, see, the damage multiplier for Chain Lightning changes based on the amount of targets hit. So 0.7, you lose 30% of damage off of Chain Lightning every time it bounces. So multiplier is used to define the amount of damage that each subsequent bounce of the chain spell does. Required aura vision. I actually cannot remember if this is even implemented right now. Take a look. And this would just be binary, a 1 or a 0. Okay, so there's only 2 spells in vanilla that currently have that. That would be Amorous. So for the aura to work or to have an applicable effect, you need to have a line of sight between the targets. This is just a way to define, like, you can't be affected by the aura if you don't have line of sight to the target. This is different than line of sight on cast, because the cast might require line of sight, but then the subsequent aura that's applied also requires line of sight. So required aura vision basically just says, hey, are you in line of sight of the target? Custom flags. These are custom flags that are assigned to certain spells, and they will have different effects. I think 128 requires you to face the target. We'll actually take a look at all the effects. Custom. Spell attributes custom. These are custom flags assigned in the database. These are not default in vanilla client. They're just used by the core to handle different spells. And they're assigned on the spell template, just because it's the most logical place to put them. So you'll see all the different ones. Allow stack between caster would be like, for example, Siphon Soul must be able to stack between the warlocks on a mob, so 5 warlocks are casting it, because the spell only allows one version per warlock at a time. It'll allow it to stack between different casters. And this will cause it to not consume multiple debuff slots. It just stacks the auras between the different casters. Ignite is a good example, where if you apply Ignite, it'll add a stack that's already existing. It won't create a new aura slot. You can define if a spell is negative or positive. This is typically used internally, but if a spell is defined as negative, let's say I had this for a few effects previously. Charismatic Aura is a really good example. Charismatic Aura is actually a positive buff that is applied to enemy units by the Paladin, which is why you don't see it in the debuff bar when they're affected by it. If it's negative, you'll see it in the debuff bar. If it's positive, you see it in the aura bar. Yeah. Yeah, Thim says, I remember back in the day, so many servers allowed mobs to front stab you and such. I re-implemented that for Everlook, the front stabbing thing, only for players and not mobs. That's due to the old way that they used to handle checking for it, because of the mob's position. For players, it's a little bit easier to calculate what is in front of you by using the has in arc function that's added to VMaNGOS. I reverted it back to the old function for players, but still obviously retain the must be facing kind of thing for the custom flags here. Yeah, so these are just custom flags, not really much to discuss. You can read out the enumerations there. That is the end of the spell template table. Now, this isn't the only thing that affects spells. Obviously, there's several other tables that do affect them. We'll go over some of them briefly and just discuss them, and we can go into greater depth next month's lesson. I'm probably going to wrap this up pretty soon, because I just want to get through the spell template, but we're going to talk about the other tables too. But essentially, this is the table that will hold all of the information for the spells. It is almost, I will say 99% a replica of what is in the DBC. Obviously, there's some changes that are in VMaNGOS and tons of Wallcraft changes. But the DBC for the spell DBC should be... So spell DBC should mirror your spell template. There's a few occasions where you don't want it to mirror it exactly. One case example I can think of the spell DBC differing from the spell template are some spell effects I don't want to be displayed on the client. Like, the player should know that they're affected by the spell, passive auras and stuff, but the core doesn't want to hide it in combat logs, so I'll change the attributes strictly within the client to not show it, but it'll still show within the server so that it's reported to the client. It's a very niche situation, but it's applicable to several things that exist in Warcraft. And it's a way to make spells function without needing to send a aura slot to the client. Or to consume the aura slot in the client, I should say. Or send the applicable visibility. So the spell DBC, I'll pull this up, is basically the same thing as the spell template. There's a few extra columns and a few missing columns. You're going to see in the spell DBC there's a lot more localizations available. Most of them aren't even filled out, but that's for localizations. Localizations are handled on the server in the localizations table. If I were to be using the a different localization, let's say I was using the Taiwan client or the Chinese client, these descriptions, these columns would be filled in instead of the English ones. I could go through and fully fill out every description so that the spell template is universal. But because I have so much custom stuff, most projects, obviously, if you're making custom stuff, you're not going to translate everything into 9 different languages. Basically, just help people learn English. Sorry, it's just it'd be less time for you. It'd be less time for everybody to learn English than it is for me to freaking add localizations for every other language. So that's just, these typically aren't going to be used that you'll see. So don't worry about them too much. But other than that, the DBC pretty much mirrors the spell template. Now, discussing a few of the other tables that do affect it, and some of the other DBCs that affect spells, you can see that they're primarily grouped up within the spell area. We're going to go through them one by one and just kind of briefly discuss them. Starting with spell effect. Spell effect is a way to define what spell affects what very easily. The spell effect is handled within the template, but if you want to use it, there's a few different cases and situations where you might want to incorporate it in the spell effect table, and that's because certain effects might not affect every different spell. Let's say, just as an example, a made-up example here, if I had a talent that increased the damage of multiple frost spells and increase the slow of only some frost spells, I would use the spell effect table to define each effect and what school it should affect. I've shaved off half of the entries from VMaNGOS, and I do plan on eventually just removing this table entirely from Wallcraft. Just simply because it's more so to address client issues. And the big reason why spell effect exists is because a lot of the, I shouldn't say a lot, but some spells in the client, they don't have the spell family flags listed, or the spell family flags have been extended and they can't be listed, so you'd use the spell effect table to properly define it. That's mostly just a 1.12 client thing, primarily. Spell area particularly deals with spells that can only be cast in specific areas. If they have requirements for quests, whether you have to start, if the quest's active, and it'll define the aura spell. But this is used primarily for specific area auras or specific gender spells. Some spells can only be cast by female characters. Those are mostly holiday event stuff, like Love is in the Air stuff. Some spells can only be cast by male characters. Some of these, like Aura spell, if I'm in a specific area and we're using the spell, it'll automatically auto-cast the Aura. You won't use this outside of a few situations, like world PvP objectives, stuff like that, holiday shit. So not really a big table you have to worry about. Spell chain. Now this is a table that you will have to incorporate if you're adding multiple ranks of spells. Let's say I wanted to add a new rank of Frostbolt. Well, if the spell is defined in a talent tree, then I don't need it to add it to spell chain because they are already defined as being existing in a chain within the talents. But if I added, like, for example, a new rank to Frostbolt, I would have to go through, and I think 116 was rank 1 Frostbolt. So you can see that, search 116. You can see all the different ranks of Frostbolt spell. You define them within the chain. Otherwise, let's say Cone of Cold has like 5 different ranks. If they weren't defined in a spell chain, then they wouldn't share any cooldown. So I'd be able to cast all 5 different ranks at once. So the spell chain just helps the core kind of sort out what spells exist within the same chain of spells that are, the same but different ranks of the spells. So you'll see the spell ID. Previous spell ID, it's 0 for rank 1 because there is no previous spell. And the first spell in the chain, you can see at the rank 10 Frostbolt, the first spell in the chain is rank 1, which is 116. Previous spell is rank 9, which is 10180. And then it defines the various ranks. Some spells might require a spell first before you can even learn or cast the spell within the chain. And obviously build min and build max is for specific client build. So some spells, their chains change between various versions of the client. There's actually only 4 that are listed within here. There's more I had the filter on. But, yeah, so if you're making custom stuff, you can really just set it to build min 0, build max 5875. And you're good to go. Spell check is only used for a small handful of spells, and these are spell instant kill effects. This is to make sure that it's not, somehow being abused or some issue where players are able to just instantly kill other players. It's basically an additional layer of checking for the instant kill effects. And yeah, you can see like Demonic Sacrifice, because it has an instant kill effect. They just want to make sure that it's targeting the correct thing and not, non-combat flavor pet, something stupid like that. Or summonable familiar from like Hound Whistle isn't getting affected by Demonic Sacrifice, because that would cause a crash in the server. So this just adds a little bit of extra layer of checking. Thim says, I think like the poison spells require rogue to know poison spell. Yeah, that's actually true. To learn the poison spells, you have to have the spell for... Yeah, let's find it. Instant poison. Search instant poison. This would be the... Okay, yeah, so I think this is the creation spell. So it's 8680. Take a look here. Okay, that's in the chain, but it doesn't have a required spell. Yeah, to like learn and cast rogue poison spells, you have to know the brewing spell, whatever, to brew poison. There are a few examples of required. Here, let's see, 25291. We'll find an example. Blessing of Might. Oh, okay. So like greater blessings, I think, are a really good example, and it actually might be the only thing. No, I believe that that's actually true. Required spell isn't handled for like the rogue poison check. That's handled elsewhere. The required spell for the spell chain table is for greater blessings and stuff like that. So like if I'm casting Greater Blessing of Might, I need to know rank 7 of Blessing of Might in order to cast the Greater Blessing of Version. So it'll oh, okay. Thim says the trainer won't let you learn them if you don't have poison learns. So that would be handled in the trainer. NPC trainer. It would required... Yeah, so to learn the spell, it would have a required skill instead. Yeah, the spell effect is for basically greater blessings and greater buffs. If you don't know the equivalent rank, you can't cast the greater version of it to apply to the whole raid. Spell disabled is a table that you can basically add spells to remove them. If you have a spell that like is causing some sort of crash or issue, just add it to this table until you can fix it, and it'll just disable the spell. There's 2 entries currently in here that are both default vanilla. Blood Fury is 1, or I'm sorry, not Blood Fury. The Orc Racial command that increases the damage of your pet as a warlock or a hunter is listed under the spell disabled field, and what it does is it prevents you from casting it. It doesn't prevent you from being affected by the spell, but it prevents you from actually casting it. That's because the Hunter Racial command is actually castable, just the way that the spell is designed within the client. It's it's castable, but you're not supposed to be able to cast it. It's just a passive aura, so you're not supposed to be able to cast it. So it's just added the spell disable to prevent you from casting it. 21563. I can't remember what that spell is. I've looked up both these before. 21563. Yeah, that's command, and the other one is 3602. Torch burst. Torch burst is like some quest item thing, I believe, where you get the quest item, and you're not supposed to be able to use the item, but you can because of the way that it works in the default client there. Alright. Spell threat table. This handles various threat modifiers for spells. Spells can either have flat threat bonuses applied, or they can have a modifier that multiplies the amount of threat. A good example is in default vanilla, like Heroic Strike adds an additional amount of threat to the attack. It's a flat amount of threat, so it's really nice. Revenge is another one that it says causes a high amount of threat. It doesn't multiply your threat in default vanilla, it just adds a high amount of flat threat, which makes it such a good tanking spell because it generates a lot of threat. In Wallcraft, those spells have actually just been changed to multipliers because they actually deal pretty significant damage now. But if you need to change threat modifiers, if a specific spell is supposed to cause more or less threat, then you can add it into here and change it in here. So it's just a table to modify threat. Oh, we kind of skipped a few though. Spell effect mod table. This is along with there's spell effect mod and spell mod. These two tables basically comprise the entirety of spell template. There's a few missing fields, but these are added so that we don't have to modify spell template when working in upstreaming fixes to VMaNGOS, because spell template is basically a copy of the client version. You don't want to touch the client version. There are a few modifications, but you basically want to pull the data from the client and use that. But obviously, some spells do need some sort of modification because that's how it was back in vanilla. You know, some spells don't work natively or they have issues, etc. So instead of modifying the spell template in like a standard VMaNGOS, you would use these two tables. Spell effect mod will change the effect, and spell mod changes like everything else: proc chance, proc flags, categories, stuff like that. So if you see an entry in the spell mods, that is because the spell has modifications made. You can see the comments. A lot of them are like fixing spell icon IDs. Most of them are in French because they were made back in the Stellaris. Like, yeah, spell placeholders, stuff like that. There's a few ones that are technically custom. Here, let's see. Spell ID. Some of the Wallcraft ones, actually, I don't have any mods because I just changed the template myself. Holy Nova, yeah, like this modifier will change the amount of threat caused by it just by changing the flag. That's because the spell threat table can't reduce threat, it only adds threat. You could multiply it by 0, in fact, probably, and have the same result, so you wouldn't even need the modifier. Yeah, just multiply it by 0. But either way, the spell mod table and the spell effect mod table are a bit deprecated, but they still, a lot of the functions are necessary, so you can't really call it deprecated. It's just, that's just the easiest way to handle any changes that need to be made to make the spells function. Spell elixir. This basically defines potions that stack with each other and various different elixir effects. You can see, I believe that these top 5 are all flasks. So if they're all listed in the same mask, they won't stack together. 17624, let's see. 17624, that's probably, yeah, petrification. So these are all the flasks. Basically just prevents you from stacking different flasks. You define them in the table here, within the category that they're in. Spell enchant charges. Is there no data on this? Check different database here. Spell enchant charges. I thought that there was values in here. Oh, okay, yeah, I removed them all. Spell enchant charges is used for rogue poison. So rogue poison in vanilla has charges. It's just handled in this table. Wallcraft got rid of that, so there's no charges on poison anymore. You don't have to keep reapplying it. And it lasts for 30 minutes now. A lot more convenient to the player. But spell enchant charges is just used to handle poison charges for rogues. Spell group is how you can basically group up spells together within specific groups. And then you can create group stack rules for how they should stack. So some groups won't have any stacking, some groups will. But it's kind of like irrelevant. Let me see. Spell lines. So yeah, here, let's look up an example here. 181, 141. Oop, too many ones. This is used for buffs, primarily. You'll see a few different auras and stuff, but like 181, 141 is for the Blessed Sunfruit Juice. So this would be like food buffs. You'll see like Blasted Lands buffs. Basically, they can't stack together. You can only have one at a time, so you would define that within the spell group, and then you define the stack rules on how many you can have. Most of the groups you'll see they only have a stack limit of 1. Some of them have a stack limit of 3. One of them has a stack limit of 0. That's weird. Spell learn spell table is for when you learn a spell, it causes you to learn a different spell. This is a bit deprecated, but it's useful because there's a few spells that do need to use this. One example is, let's see, 8681. Okay, instant poison. So 2842 is the brewing poison skill. When you learn brewing poison, it will automatically teach you instant poison rank 1. So it's just a way to efficiently handle mostly training spells for specific professions. When you learn a profession, it'll automatically teach you like 1 or 2 spells. 5149 is probably a profession, probably like blacksmithing or something. Oh, beast training. Okay, so when you learn beast training, it will also teach you 1853, which is growl, and 14922, which is also growl. Yeah, so like there's just some spells that automatically teach you other spells. Spell mod we talked about. Spell pet auras are auras that your pet may have. Let's see, 1863. This is for specific pets, like what aura, and I'm pretty sure this is particularly pertaining to warlocks pets. Okay, Master Demonologist is one. So like 23785. So 1863 would be the pet entry for the creature entry. 23785, 23785, 23785. That's the 4 warlock pets. They all know Master Demonologist. That's because they actually carry the aura. Since the way that the spell works, it says grants both the warlock and the summon demon in effect as long as that demon is active. The way that that is handled is for the pets to actually carry the aura themselves. That'll be defined in this table. There's a few other weird ones like this one, 19028. Soul Link, yeah, that's another one where there's no specific definition for the pet, just any warlock pet. Spirit Bond is another 19578. So there's no definition for the pet, but the pet actually carries the aura. And that's also Spirit Bond, rank 1 and 2. So yeah, that's just for pet auras. Spell proc event. Now, we talked about spell procs listed in the spell template, but that's a very rudimentary version. You can add the spell proc flags and the chance of the proc, but to define stuff like proc per minute, or what spell it should actually proc from, specifically, you would use the spell proc event. So, let's say I add a spell, a good one would be Grand Crusader for the Paladin, which every time you cast Crusader Strike, it applies a buff that increases your attack speed. It stacks up to 5 times. Well, I need to define that it only procs off of Crusader Strike, and it has a 100% proc chance, so it would have a custom chance of 100. There's no internal cooldown. Obviously, the build is 5875, no minimum build. There's no proc per minute rate, so that's 0. And we can define proc flags. Proc flags and proc EX are information that's contained in spell defines. Let's find it. Proc flags, we can define how it should proc. If it's, procking from us dealing melee, or taking melee, dealing spell, dealing range, taking damage, taking periodic, all sorts of different flags. So, you'll have a lot of different ways to define how you want the spell to proc. Some of them just became deprecated, some of the custom ones, which kind of sucks because it broke a lot of stuff, but I fixed it all. Some of them were convenient, but you don't need them. Now they're actually working right. But yeah, you can define procs, and you can also define proc X. So if a spell only procs when you crit, you would define the proc EX to only be critical hit. Only procs when you deal melee damage, and the melee damage has to be a crit. You would include both flags. You can include as many flags as you want. So like some spells, they'll proc from anytime you deal damage or take damage, it'll proc, etc. You can define all the different aspects of how you want the spell to proc. And again, family masks, if you want to specify exactly what spell it procs from, you can use family masks. Just make sure you include the correct family name. And you can even define if you just want to proc off a specific school. Like anytime you deal fire damage, it'll proc. Well, then I would just define the school as fire, and whatever proc flag is that I need for it. Proc item enchant is for weapon enchants, lifesteal, crusader, fiery, and this just defines their proc per minute rates. Spell scripts, we're not even going to touch on that. This is used for the scripting system. You can see some of the examples. There's not many entries. This is pretty specific for certain things. Certain quests, certain whatevers. There's only 47 total entries in this, though. So you'll notice. Go back to the other table here. Other database. So yeah, spell scripts, this is just for specific scripting functions. Spell script targets, same kind of thing. It'll specifically target certain things based off of the GUID of the creature. That's not something that we'll touch on this week, though. Spell target position, same kind of thing. These are for... Well, spell target position is used to define things like teleport spells, like where is it going to send you. You define the target map, position X, Y, and Z, orientation that they arrived with. So, it's that'll be used for some things, but most of them are predefined, and a lot of them too are even held in the game tally table. Let me take a look through the chat real quick, see what we got. Okay, cool. Thim's created a spell, so let's take a look at what he did. Last month we had assigned some homework. I told people, all right, try and make a spell and see what you got. We'll review it. Hey, that's a nice spell. Let's replay that. So he created an item and assigned a spell to it. I'm actually gonna pause. So he created an item, and the item has a spell assigned to it in the item template, and the spell is custom, creates a soul shard that can be used for various rituals. So it's a create soul shard spell assigned to this item, 30-minute cooldown, which means he would have to basically have used a create item spell. That's very nice quality of life spell. I'm gonna have to steal that. Though I do have plans on modifying the stupid Sunken Temple trinket to basically do that thing. Yeah, very, very cool spell. Cool. Glad somebody actually went through, though, and did the homework. Yeah, very nice. So, since I don't have the spell, we'll just look up an example of another create item spell. The Conjure Health Stone, which would basically be the same effect, or Health Stone. No, create Healthstone. Create Healthstone Major. Take a look at this. This is the player cast spell. Just want to make sure it's not the trainer spell. And this would have the effect of 77. Would have a category cooldown of just one global cooldown, 1.5 seconds. His would have obviously the cooldown as well added to. Where is it? Recovery time. Could be category recovery time depending on how he implemented it. But if it's an individual item too, the item itself will contain the cooldown information since it's cast off an item. So we can just say nifty stopwatch. You can see. Take a look at the newer one. So items that have a spell assigned, you assign the cooldown directly to the item instead of the spell. So nifty stopwatch has 30-minute cooldown. It would be the same for his spell. Then it would have effect 77. Let's find it. Effect 77. So we'll go take a look at our spell defines for the effects. Spell effect, script effect. So he actually implemented this through the core. Oh, that's solid. Yeah, there you go. Thim says, I use the one that creates a Lily. Just copied Lily spells, and I use the category of Benediction and Anathema to make all the soul bags share cooldown. Excellent use. Very wise, too, for the categories, because the categories are predefined and they're original named. There's like 200 different spell category cooldowns that are default vanilla. You can add additional ones if you want, but because like Benediction and Anathema cooldown won't exist on another Warlock spell, you can just use that for the category. Oh, use the create item one? Okay. Lilies. Oh, let's just pull up the spell here. Oh, Conjure Lily. That's what it's called. Yeah, Conjure Lily root. Okay, so that's got effect 24. The reason that the Create Healthstone had a script effect of 77 is because it has a check for the Healthstone one specifically. The Lay of Lilies would just be effect 24, which would be create item. And you have the category cooldown for Anathema and Benediction. Good choice of that because Warlocks don't utilize that. It's a priest one. They might, but typically not. And it would have effect 24, and it would create the item. There's no auras applied. It's a very simple effect to create because you don't have to define like anything else besides the item that's being created. So you would have copied the spell, changed the name, changed the item that's created, created a new item that actually casts the spell, assigned the cooldown and the spell cast inside the item, and changed the description. And then he would have had to basically taken that new spell that he had created and then created also within the DBC, and then moved that file from the DBC into the custom patch. So he would have gone through and, here, what's the Lay of Lily spells? 18831, so we can actually just copy that. And I don't know what my latest spell is. Let's take a look real quick. I don't want recent filters. 35600, so I'm going to increment that. 5601. I want to change the patch, or the client build 5875. And I'm going to add that by executing. And yeah, that's our spell categories here. Priest, Epic. Okay. Spell category, item, priest, epic, staff, 1160 category. And create Soul Shard. Never remember the item ID on that. It's like 7175 or something. 6265. Spell icon. Change the spell icon. Yeah, screw it. Just keep the spell icon. It's not a big deal. Conjure Soul Shard. Doesn't have ranks, so we'll move that. Soul Shard. Create a basic description. Global cooldown. Okay. Ah, crap. I clicked a different database. Conjure Lily. What was the ID of that? 18831. So we would go 1831. I'm just gonna right click and copy the line from the spell that we're copying over. I'm going to click here and paste the line. 1165. Oh crap. I hate when I do this. I accidentally moved down one more row in WDBX because that it creates a new row and then it overwrites the next increment of the row. So if I delete this and then create a new row later, it'll be 35603. It's really annoying. Kind of a frustration there. 6265. Conjure Soul Shard. No rank. is a soul shard. And I could set a class mask, but since this is cast from an item spell, it's not a big deal. 35601. And Ring of Souls. I'm just going to add this to the tournament ring that I had created yesterday. A 30-minute cooldown. $40257. And now we're gonna make sure we got this saved. Now that we've created the spell in the database and also created it in the DBC, we're going to want to take that and incorporate it into the client patch. So we're going to our client's data folder. We're going to open up patch 3. I feel like this is not correct for spells. No, it's got to be. Okay. Yeah, I was wondering about some of the M2s and textures I was using. Okay, that's kind of a faux pas. Because I have the server set up on my network drive, I actually don't want to pull that over right now. I modified basically the wrong one. So I'm just going to close all these out. I'm going to redo it. The right one. File. I gotta grab the 5875 from my network drive instead. Them says, yeah, it messes up stuff like that. What are you referring to? If you're talking about my 5875, it's just because I think the server's 5875 is actually newer. I don't want to accidentally overwrite shit. So we're just going to remake it. Not the newer spell template. Or the server spell template, not my local one. What was the Lay of Lilies again? One 8831. Oh, I don't think there was any changes made recently, so I doubt that it would matter. Six two six five. I like how Lay of Lilies has rank 1, implying that they were going to add extra ranks of different stuff you could conjure to eat. Conjures a soul shard. Okay, we're going to save this, and then we're going to add the star patch. Oh, WDBX? Yeah, it's super annoying. I used to use, the other one, the other shitty one. The other one's got a lot of issues to it, like, will randomly override fucking entire rows and stuff for some of the DBCs. And it's got, like, no definitions. With the control scheme was better because it was more in line with, like, actual SQL editors, and there was a lot less, like, frustrating things. I don't know, both have their pluses and minuses. WDBX is a lot better, but... Okay, so we added spell DBC that we have updated with the new spell to our client patch. Close that. And now we're going to boot up the dev server. Yeah, my DBC, the old ancient one, super janky German one. It's like all the error alerts are in German. Yeah, my DBC editor. Kind of jank. But it's nice because it was a lot faster to work with. It was more responsive, and it had the same control scheme as SQL editors. Whereas WDBX has like its own system. It's more like Excel. Kind of annoying. Alright, we're booting up the dev server so we can go test our new spell. I gotta delete my WDB. Yeah, why is that time so long? I don't know what, probably because I haven't booted the dev server a long time. Souls. Yeah, item 40257. That's such a useful spell. Excellent job, Thims. Super nice. Thim says, I added some more vids of, like, different bags with other spells that make more shards. Oh, hell yeah. See, that's gonna be so nice, too, because the Warlock Soul Shard bag having that effect, being able to cast it, like, using the bag itself, it's really cool, because I sat there brainstorming, too. I'm like, what the hell do I add to the friggin' Soul Shard bag besides, like, making your pet do more damage or some kind of corny like that? Being able to just summon a Soul Shard using the bag, hell yeah, dude, like, that's brilliant. Excellent. Cool. Yeah, so it's an example basically of, we took a look at how a spell worked on the video and basically just created it ourselves here. So it's a very, very easy routine. If you see something cool, I just watched Dinkledork's video, and I can't remember, he's using Catacliant with his new flight thing, but the spell that he had created, like the friggin' DBZ Super Saiyan flying shit, like, I saw that and I'm like, oh, that's crazy. I wanted to basically do the same effect for the Warlock's Metamorphosis Voidwalker charge, where you're gonna, like, you'll jump up in the air kind of like that. It won't be so high, you'll jump up like 10 feet, and then you'll basically do the same charge. It'll be a directed charge, not just like a not a selected direction, but a directed charge at a unit target, kind of like the same effect. Not so much of the visual stuff, but basically the same idea is what I was going to add to the Warlock Metamorphosis. So to see him add it, even though it's a later client, which probably has better movement extrapolation functions for it, it definitely is doable in vanilla. So to see him do it, yeah, it's definitely cool. Give me a little bit of inspiration there. Well, that's about all the spell tables. That is all the spell tables. There's a few other tables that might affect it, and There's a few other things that we'll want to review next week, like skill line ability. This is basically, I'll just give a brief overview, but we're going to close out the lesson with this. Skill line ability is essentially how you sort the spells within your spell book. If you don't have a skill line ability assigned for the spell, it'll just appear in your general spell book. And this also has different functions for restricting it to like certain classes, certain races. Like you can see the skill ID requirements, which are defined within the core. We'll review that a little bit more in detail next week. You can also create like superseded by spell, so basically if a rank replaces different ranks and removes the other ranks from your spell book, you would define it in here. This is probably the last major table for doing spells in game. You need to have this within your client, otherwise it won't function. And one thing I want to say is, do not delete entries from this. And if you fuck up entries in this, the server will crash or the client will crash. So this is a pretty important table. I want to make sure, just so that's clear, you need to have the spell properly added in the skill line ability. It's very important to do it right. So we'll review this further in detail next week for skill line ability, and that's probably what we're going to pick up, and then talk about some of the item templates and stuff like that. Not next week, I'm sorry, next month. And then during the summer, we'll start discussing a little bit more about like game objects and the various other tables. We'll pretty much just go down through the list, but I wanted to get spell out of the way because that's really the big one that people are looking for. So yeah, next month's lesson is going to be continuation of this. It'll start with the skill line ability and then talk about a few more. It'll be the same day, same time. It'll be the last Sunday of the month, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Very glad everybody was able to tune in, and we were able to get some more info put down on video here and answer some questions. And I'm really glad somebody did the homework assignment, so we were able to review and check out the work they had done. Really creative there, really good function, and really good quality of life stuff for vanilla there. Warlocks are always struggling with, oh, I'm in the middle of a boss fight and I don't have a soul shard. It really sucks. My pet's dead. So it's like having that is huge quality of life and something that players will appreciate, and to be able to extend that onto things like Warlock Soul Shard bags that already exist in game is a very, very, very wise introduction of that spell. And it keeps it balanced, and it creates functionality for pre-existing items, so it expands the meta of those items. Very, very good job there. Excellent lesson. Sorry about the first 45 minutes. We had to redo it because of the mic issue, but glad we got that done. Yeah, if there's any questions, anything you got, just holler at me on the Discord. Don't forget to join wallcraft.org, and if you're interested in joining the classroom sessions so you can give live feedback and discuss and get hands-on training, just sign up on the Patreon. Any tier is available. Or if you're a content creator, if you don't want to shell out $5 a month, just make a video on Wallcraft, and I'll give you a content creator role, and that gets you access to the classroom as well. So, do a little bit of promotion for me, and I'm more than happy to lend whatever knowledge I got. I got the videos, they're uploaded on YouTube, free to view, and I try and spread them around so people have a little bit of information. They're just meant to be informative and kind of give a little bit of info, but, you know, best I can do is just hope to help other people here. Much appreciated. We're going to wrap up this lesson. I'm going to close the stream, and until next time, see y'all later.